at her mother's funeral, in front of more than 200 mourners standing in the silence that only a cemetery can produce. A man reached across his grieving wife, gripped the gold pendant at her throat, and snapped the chain clean off her neck, then turned and clasped it around another woman's neck, right there, 3 feet from an open casket. Nadine Ashworth was 38 years old, 4 hours into the worst grief of her life, and the man she had spent 12 years married to had just made sure the entire world saw what he thought of her. What her husband Conrad did not know, what not a single person standing in that cemetery understood, was that 61 minutes before that moment, Nadine had quietly become the sole heir to a $70 billion estate, and she had already decided not to say a word about it. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. If this is your first time joining us, we are so glad you found this channel. Please take a moment right now to like this video, hit that subscribe button, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Are you in Georgia, Texas, or maybe up in Canada? Are you watching from the UK, Nigeria, South Africa, or somewhere we haven't heard from yet? We read every single comment, and this community is everywhere. Now settle in and get comfortable. This story is going to stay with you for a long time. Nadine Ashworth grew up understanding 2 things about her mother. The first was that Iris Ashworth loved quietly and without announcement. She never raised her voice, never explained herself more than once, and never needed anyone to validate a decision she had already made. She simply acted, and the results spoke for whatever she had intended. The second thing Nadine understood about her mother was that Iris had money, but not in any form that could be easily seen, measured, or pointed to. Iris didn't live in a sprawling estate or drive a luxury vehicle. She kept a modest 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb outside of Richmond, Virginia, drove a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard she refused to have replaced, and wore the same small gold pendant around her neck for as long as Nadine could remember. A simple oval locket with a hand-engraved floral border along the edge. Nothing flashy, nothing that would cause a stranger to look twice. What the world didn't know about Iris Ashworth was that 30 years ago, before Nadine was even born, Iris had quietly co-founded a pharmaceutical logistics company with 2 business partners. Over the decades that followed, while Iris lived by choice the way a middle-class woman lives, that company had grown into a privately held giant, a cold-chain logistics network supplying hospital systems across North America and parts of Europe. The partners had bought Iris out on paper nearly 20 years earlier, but there was a clause, one her attorney had called unnecessarily complicated at the time of signing, that preserved a silent compounding equity stake in her name for as long as she declined to claim it. Iris never claimed it. She let it sit untouched for 30 years like a sealed letter she had written to the future. And when Iris Ashworth passed at 69 from a sudden cardiac event on a quiet Tuesday morning in April, the number that had been sitting, silently, invisibly, accruing year after year while her daughter grew up and married and built a life, had reached $70 billion. Nadine did not know the full figure until the morning of the funeral itself. Iris's personal attorney, a quiet and precise man named Desmond Farr, had called the evening before and asked her to come to his office before the service. He said it was routine. He said it wouldn't take long. Nadine had gone, still wearing the black dress she'd put on and hadn't taken off for 2 days, her eyes raw from barely sleeping, and sat across from Desmond as he opened a leather portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward her. She read it. She read it again. She looked up at him slowly. He nodded once. She asked him how something like this was even possible. He explained about the clause, about the compounding structure, about the trust Iris had built around the stake to keep it invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically and deliberately looking for it. He told Nadine that as the sole named beneficiary in a trust amendment signed and notarized just 6 months before Iris died, she was now the controlling heir to everything. Not a portion of it, not a percentage, Everything. Nadine sat with that information for a long, still moment. Then she thanked Desmond, folded the paper carefully, placed it in her purse, and walked outside to the car where Conrad was waiting to drive her to the cemetery. She didn't say a single word about what had just happened. She looked out the passenger window the entire drive and let him assume her silence was grief. Conrad Ashworth. Nadine had kept his last name, though she had her own career, her own professional reputation, and her own identity that existed entirely independent of him. Was 42 years old, and the particular kind of man who had always believed his worth could be measured by how close he stood to power. He was handsome in a practiced, self-aware way. He dressed carefully. He had a talent for entering a room and making everyone in it feel as though he'd been personally invited by whoever mattered most. He'd built a mid-level commercial real estate development firm that performed respectably. Nothing remarkable, but enough to give him the language of success at dinner parties and enough to allow him to speak about the life he had provided for them. Even though Nadine's salary as a senior partner at a major healthcare consulting firm had quietly covered more of that life than Conrad ever acknowledged, or perhaps was ever willing to see. Their marriage had been eroding for years. Nadine knew this with the calm certainty of a person who had stopped fighting a slow diagnosis and simply begun planning around it. She had tried, genuinely, deliberately tried. There had been 2 rounds of couples counseling, one honest and devastating conversation on their back porch during the summer of their 9th year together, and a stretch of about 18 months that had actually felt like something healing. But then Conrad's business hit a prolonged rough patch, and he responded to difficulty the way he had always responded to difficulty, by finding someone outside the marriage who made him feel like he hadn't failed. Nadine discovered the woman. Her name was Petra. She was 34 years old, and she worked as a project coordinator in Conrad's office. Through a credit card statement she had not been meant to see. Hotel charges, restaurant charges, charges from a jewelry store Nadine had never once been taken to. She did not confront him. Not yet. She consulted an attorney first, a woman named Vivian Cole who had been in family law for 19 years and who had, in Nadine's first consultation, listened to the whole situation and said simply, "Good. You came early." Over the following 3 months, Nadine gathered documentation quietly. Financial records, shared account histories, property deeds, business valuations, and a private investigator's report that filled 43 pages. She was preparing. She was almost ready to move. And then her mother died, and everything paused. Conrad had been appropriately composed in public during the visitation and the days leading up to the service. He held Nadine's hand in the receiving line. He said the right things to her mother's oldest friends. He stood where he was supposed to stand and wore the correct expression. But Nadine noticed, she always noticed, that he had checked his phone 11 times in the span of a 2-hour window the evening of the visitation, and that he had excused himself twice for calls he took around the side of the building, out of view, speaking in a low voice that carried none of the careful grief of the rest of his performance. She didn't say anything. She was burying her mother. She was conserving every last piece of herself for what mattered. The morning of the funeral, while Nadine was sitting inside Desmond Farr's office reading the document that permanently altered the landscape of her entire life, Conrad was sitting outside in the car with his phone. He had apparently told Petra about the service. He had, by the evidence that followed, invited her to attend. Nadine would not know this until she saw her standing at the edge of the service canopy. The cemetery was a rolling green space on the western edge of Richmond, lined with old oak trees that turned the canopy into something almost peaceful despite everything. There were 217 people in attendance. Iris had lived quietly, but she had touched an enormous number of lives that Nadine was only beginning to fully understand. Former colleagues, neighbors going back 30 years, people whose names Nadine barely recognized who came to her one by one and said things about her mother she had never been told before. A woman who said Iris had anonymously paid her family's medical bills for 6 months during a year they nearly lost everything. A retired teacher who said Iris had written him a handwritten letter after his wife passed, and that he had kept it folded in his wallet for 7 years. Nadine stood in that space and absorbed each story, and she felt her grief transform, slowly and unexpectedly, from sharp and hollow into something closer to reverence. She was standing near the head of the casket, one hand resting lightly on the dark polished wood, when she felt the movement at the back of her neck. A hand. Her first thought was comfort, an arm coming around her shoulder, the instinctive gesture of someone offering support. But the motion was wrong. It was too precise, too deliberate, too focused on a single point. She felt the chain tighten at her throat for a half-second, and then she heard it. A clean, hard snap, and the weight of the pendant left her neck. She turned slightly. Conrad stepped around her left side, walked directly to a woman standing at the outer edge of the canopy in a dark blue dress, and fastened the pendant around that woman's neck with the slow, unhurried hands of someone who has decided they are doing something worth seeing. Petra stood there and received it. He did it slowly, the way someone makes a statement. The silence that passed through the assembled crowd was the particular silence of 200 people registering something that the mind refuses, for a brief and surreal moment, to process as real. Someone near the back of the gathering made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that carried. A woman who had known Iris Ashworth for 40 years pressed both hands over her mouth and did not lower them for a long time. Two of Nadine's cousins exchanged a look that held every word they were not saying out loud. Nadine did not move. She did not speak. She stood at the head of her mother's casket, her hands still resting on the dark wood, and she looked at Conrad with an expression that several people who were present that day would later describe, when retelling this story to their own families and friends, as the calmest face they had ever seen on a human being standing inside pain. Not frozen, not numb, calm, deliberate, the expression of someone who already knows. Conrad held her gaze. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed this scene, who had decided somewhere in the preceding days that if he was going to end things, he would end them completely and publicly, on his own terms, in a way that left her too exposed and too shattered to fight back with anything other than emotion. He wanted her to break. He needed her to break, because a broken woman doesn't strategize. A broken woman doesn't file motions or review financial records or retain experienced attorneys. He had calculated that the worst moment of her life was also his best opportunity. He had miscalculated absolutely everything. Nadine turned back to face the casket. She said goodbye to her mother in a whisper that was only for the two of them. Then she straightened her dress, walked to the waiting car, sat down in the back seat, and made 3 phone calls. The first was to Desmond Farr. The second was to Vivian Cole, who had been waiting, patiently, methodically, for Nadine's signal for 3 months. The third was to her closest friend, a woman named Britt who had known Nadine since their first year of college, who had never once fully trusted Conrad, and who said, "Tell me where you are," before Nadine had even finished the sentence. If you are still watching at this point, drop the words, "I'm still here," in the comments right now. Because what comes next is the part that Conrad never saw coming, and I want you to stay for every word of it. The days that followed the funeral were, on the surface, quiet. Conrad returned to the house that evening, made himself a drink he didn't finish, and told Nadine, in the reasonable, measured tone of a man who believes he is handling things maturely, that they both knew this was over, and that the most dignified course was to handle the separation like adults. He said he would move to the spare room until arrangements could be made. He said he was not trying to be cruel. Nadine stood in the kitchen doorway holding a glass of water and listened to every word. When he finished, she said, "Okay, just that. One word." Then she walked upstairs. Conrad had anticipated a scene. Crying, accusations, a door slammed somewhere in the house, tearful ultimatums delivered from a place of desperation. Her stillness unsettled him in a way he couldn't name precisely, so he filed it under grief and moved forward with his plans. What was already in motion, invisible to him entirely, was this. Vivian Cole had filed the divorce petition the following morning, citing marital misconduct, and had attached as supporting documentation the full 3-month evidence package, financial records, dated hotel receipts, a signed 43-page affidavit from the private investigator, and a documented timeline of the affair. She had also filed a financial disclosure motion requiring Conrad to produce a complete accounting of his business assets, personal accounts, and outstanding liabilities within 30 days. Standard procedure in divorce filings. Routine, even. But in this particular case, there was an edge to it that Conrad hadn't thought to anticipate, because for 12 years, Conrad had periodically used Nadine's income and her credit standing to backstop deals in his real estate business. There were 6 instances across their marriage in which she had co-signed documents without fully understanding the scope of what she was authorizing. Vivian Cole had found all 6. Every single one was now a lever. News of the Iris Ashworth estate began to surface 9 days after the funeral, when Desmond Farr filed the required trust documentation with the appropriate financial regulators. It wasn't headline news. The trust structure had been built to move with minimal public exposure. But within certain financial circles, among the people whose professional lives require them to pay attention to private equity disclosures and trust transfers of significant size, the number circulated. $70 billion. Sole beneficiary, Nadine Ashworth. A name that meant nothing to anyone in that world yet, but which would not remain unknown for long. Conrad found out on a Thursday morning through a business contact who called with the barely contained energy of someone delivering information they know will change the entire shape of a conversation. Conrad listened. He asked 3 clarifying questions. He sat down slowly on the edge of his desk. He did the math, and then he did it again. Then he called his attorney, a man named Garrick who handled most of his corporate work, and told him to pause whatever was currently moving with the divorce filing and reach out to Nadine's side to request a conversation about settlement. That evening, Conrad sent Nadine a text message. He said he had been doing a great deal of thinking. He said grief does things to people that they don't fully understand until later. He said what happened at the cemetery was indefensible and he wasn't asking for forgiveness, only a conversation. He ended the message with 3 words he had not spoken to her in over 4 years. I still love you. Nadine read the message. She set the phone face down on the kitchen table. She finished her dinner. She did not reply. Vivian Cole's response to the settlement overture from Garrick's office was precise and unhurried. Any discussions would proceed exclusively through counsel, would require complete and verified financial disclosure from both parties, and would not result in any pause or delay of the existing proceedings. She also filed, that same week, a motion to include the structure and value of the Iris Ashworth Estate Trust as contextual financial background in determining equitable distribution. Not because the trust itself was marital property. It wasn't, having originated entirely outside the marriage and been transferred through inheritance, but because the motion forced every party involved to see the full and accurate picture of who each person in this marriage actually was financially, and what the true power arrangement had always been between them. Garrick told Conrad what he already understood about the trust. It was unreachable, premarital in its origin, inherited outright, and structured by Iris's legal team in a way that placed it entirely beyond the reach of divorce proceedings under Virginia law. Conrad knew this, but a financial advisor he had called separately, in a moment of quiet panic, had told him that Nadine's willingness to settle without escalation would depend heavily on how cooperative Conrad chose to be. And Conrad, who had spent 12 years absorbing his wife's professional income and built his self-image on a foundation that was partly hers without ever crediting it, had exactly 1 card remaining, the 6 co-signed documents. He instructed Garrick to use them, to signal carefully but unmistakably, that if Nadine pursued aggressive terms, Conrad would argue that her co-signatures constituted material financial participation in his business, that she could potentially be held partially liable for certain outstanding obligations. It was a legal stretch. Garrick said so twice, with increasing directness. But Conrad believed the threat alone would be enough to make a grieving woman hesitate, to slow her down, to make the path of least resistance seem more appealing than a long and ugly fight. Vivian Cole received this signal and did something that Garrick had not anticipated. She welcomed it warmly. She called his office directly and informed him that if Conrad intended to pursue the argument of financial partnership, she would be very pleased to compel a full and complete disclosure of every transaction made under that partnership, including, she noted, several real estate dealings from 2021 and 2022 that she had reason to believe had not been entirely clean. She used exactly those words. Not entirely clean. She did not elaborate further. She thanked him for his time and ended the call. She didn't need to elaborate. Garrick called Conrad within the hour with a different recommendation. The real estate business, Conrad's identity, his pride, the thing he talked about at every dinner table as proof of who he was, had a problem. Nothing that had crossed into criminal territory under ordinary circumstances. But across 3 specific transactions from 2021 and 2022, property valuations had been meaningfully inflated to secure favorable financing from an institutional lender. That lender was now under pressure from its own regulators and had recently begun a quiet internal review of its own portfolio. If those 3 transactions were subpoenaed into a divorce proceeding, if they became part of a public financial disclosure that neither side could contain, the internal review would become an external regulatory investigation. Conrad would lose the business license. Not possibly, not probably, definitively, and without a great deal of time for appeals. He pulled the co-signature thread off the table entirely. He instructed Garrick to explore settlement in good faith. There was a moment. Vivian Cole described it later over coffee in her office as Nadine sat across from her, when the tone of a particular phone call from Garrick shifted in a way that was subtle and unmistakable at once. It was the specific pause of a man who has just understood, for the first time, that he is not the more powerful person in the conversation he thought he was having, that he had walked into a room with an assumed arrangement and discovered the arrangement was precisely the inverse of what he had expected. Vivian said she had spent 19 years in family law, and that particular pause, the breath before the pivot, was the most satisfying sound in the profession. The settlement took 6 weeks to finalize. During that time, Conrad moved out of the house into a furnished short-term apartment across the city. Petra, it turned out, had ended things with him approximately 2 weeks after the funeral. She had apparently concluded that the performance at the cemetery was not the introduction she had wanted to a future relationship, and that a man willing to humiliate his grieving wife over an open casket was not a man whose next chapter she wanted to be part of. Conrad did not know that Nadine was aware of this development. Nadine saw no reason to tell him. The final settlement agreement gave Nadine the house. Her name had been on the deed from the beginning, a detail Conrad had never thought to examine closely. It gave her full legal release and indemnification from all 6 co-signed business documents, protecting her completely from any future liability. It required the sale of Conrad's interest in 2 jointly held investment properties with an equal division of proceeds. It required Conrad to produce, in writing and with full legal documentation, the return of all personal property belonging to Iris Ashworth, including, listed specifically and by exact description in the itemized schedule, 1 gold oval pendant with hand-engraved floral border, chain repaired to original condition. Garrick's office had included that item almost as an afterthought when compiling the property schedule. But Nadine had named it first. She had given Vivian that description in their very first post-funeral meeting, before they had discussed anything else on the list. Vivian had asked once, gently, whether it was about grief, about the loss of her mother, and the specific violence of that moment at the graveside. Nadine thought about the question honestly before answering. Then she said, "It's about the principal. He took something that wasn't his. He needs to return it with his signature on a legal document." The pendant arrived by certified mail 23 days after the settlement was signed. It came in a small velvet pouch inside a padded envelope with no note and no letter. The chain had been repaired. She had not requested this specifically, but someone had arranged it. Nadine held it in her open palm for a long time. Then she put it on. She stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, in her house, in her city, in the life that was now entirely, cleanly, legally hers. And she looked at herself wearing her mother's necklace, and she stayed there until the feeling settled into something she recognized as peace. The story did not end quietly, of course. These things rarely do when the underlying architecture was always unstable. For months after the settlement was signed, the financial institution that had backed Conrad's 3 troubled transactions completed its internal review and escalated its findings to the appropriate regulators. The story appeared first in a regional business publication, then spread into broader financial news coverage once the specific numbers, nearly $14 million in inflated property valuations across 3 transactions, became available. Conrad's business license was suspended pending investigation. 2 of his remaining development partners dissolved their agreements within 72 hours of the first story appearing. He retained a criminal defense attorney. None of this was Nadine's doing. She had not triggered the review, had not contacted journalists, had not placed a single call in that direction. The institution's internal review had been underway before Vivian Cole had ever made her carefully calibrated comment to Garrick. It had existed independently, moving at its own bureaucratic pace, entirely separate from the divorce proceedings. Nadine's case hadn't accelerated anything. It had simply, briefly, cast a light near something that was already illuminated and waiting. But there is a particular kind of irony in watching a man who believed he could embarrass someone into powerlessness discover that the world keeps its own accounting, on its own timetable, and doesn't need to be asked. That people who do quiet wrong accrue quiet consequences. That the woman he had dismissed at a graveside as broken, isolated, and alone had simply been holding everything still, conserving her energy for something he couldn't see and hadn't thought to look for. Britt came over the evening the news story broke. She brought food and a bottle of wine, and they sat on the back porch of Nadine's house. The same porch where Nadine and Conrad had once had their long, honest, and ultimately insufficient conversation about saving something they were both losing, and they talked until well past midnight. At one point Britt looked at her and asked, honestly, "Did you ever think about making a call? Pointing someone toward those deals?" Nadine considered the question without deflecting it. Then she said, "No, I didn't have to. Some fires burn without you." Britt held her gaze for a long moment and said, "Your mother would have said that." Nadine smiled, and her hand went to the pendant at her throat. Desmond Farr walked Nadine through the full scope of the trust over the course of several weeks of carefully paced meetings. The complete picture of what Iris had built and chosen deliberately and for 30 years to conceal came into focus gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. And with each piece of it, Nadine understood her mother more completely and more deeply than she had in all the years they had shared the same world. Iris hadn't been eccentric or secretive for its own sake. She had been precise. She had looked at the world with open, clear eyes and concluded that visible wealth is a liability, that the people drawn to money are rarely the people worth being drawn to. She had built her entire life as a test, not a cruel one, a necessary one. By choosing to live as she lived, she had ensured that every person who sat at her table, who called her in a difficult moment, who stood at her graveside on a Tuesday morning in April, had come for Iris. Not for anything she owned, not for anything she could give them, just for her. Nadine thought about Conrad. She thought about 3 words in a text message sent the evening after he discovered the number 70 billion. She thought about a pendant snapped from her neck above a casket, and she understood, with a quiet and permanent clarity, that her mother had been right about everything. She took 3 full months before making any significant decisions about the estate. Desmond advised patience, and Nadine was constitutionally built for it. She kept working. She maintained her apartment for another season before fully settling back into the house. She kept her routines, her hours, her small close circle, Britt, 2 colleagues she genuinely valued, a neighbor she had coffee with on Saturday mornings. She told Desmond in one of their early formal meetings that she was not interested in becoming a different version of herself. She was interested in making sure the right things were protected and the wrong things had no further access to her life. The first major decision she made with the estate was to fund the cardiac care wing of a hospital in Richmond. Not in her own name, in Iris's. She told Desmond the naming rights were not negotiable. The wing would carry her mother's name, or she would find another institution. The hospital agreed within 48 hours of receiving the proposal. The second decision was smaller in scale but felt, to Nadine, more important than anything else on the list. She established a fund, managed quietly through the trust structure, to cover the medical expenses of families in financial crisis at 3 hospital systems across the Mid-Atlantic region. Anonymous. No application process. Identified through social workers already embedded in those institutions. Funded without the recipient ever being informed of the source. She told Britt about it one evening on the back porch, and Britt said quietly, "That is so Iris." Nadine said, "That's exactly the goal." The third decision was to keep the house. She had worried for a time that she would want to leave it, that the building carried too much of the wrong kind of history to ever feel entirely comfortable again. But she walked through it one afternoon in early autumn, with the October light coming through the kitchen windows at the particular angle it always came through in October, and she thought about what the house actually contained. 12 years of a marriage, yes, but also a life she had genuinely built. Dinners she had cooked for people she loved. Conversations that had mattered in the rooms they happened in. A garden in the back that she had planted herself, section by patient section, across 5 separate summers. The history wasn't all wrong. A significant portion of it was entirely, unambiguously hers. She decided she was staying. Conrad's legal situation resolved over the following year in the way these things tend to resolve when someone can still retain capable counsel and the violations, while financially serious, do not cross the specific threshold of criminal indictment. He paid substantial civil penalties. His license was suspended for 14 months. When he restarted, it was smaller and slower, a one-person operation, a fraction of the portfolio, deals that required no partners because no partners of any standing were currently available to him. The people who had known him in the Richmond development community were not unkind when they encountered him, but they were careful in the precise and deliberate way that people are careful with someone whose floor has been revealed. He was no longer the person in any room who appeared to be the most powerful guest, whether he ever fully assembled the sequence of events in his own mind. The timing of the inheritance, the 3 months of quiet preparation that had preceded the cemetery, the document in the purse on the drive there, the single word she had spoken when he told her he was moving into the spare room, is something Nadine has no way of knowing. They do not speak. The settlement is complete. Their lives do not intersect. She does not wish him harm. She does not, truly, wish him anything at all. She has the house, the garden, her mother's necklace, and a life that is entirely her own for the first time. There is something Iris said to her once, when Nadine was in her mid-20s and working through a professional setback, that had shaken her confidence more than she wanted to admit. Iris had listened to the entire story without interrupting before saying, with the same quiet certainty she brought to every observation she ever made, "The people who underestimate you are doing you a favor. Let them. Nadine had not fully understood it at 26. She understood it completely now. She wore the pendant to Desmond Farr's office on the day she signed the final documents formally establishing the Iris Ashworth Charitable Trust as an independent operating entity. He noticed it as she sat down and said, "Beautiful necklace." She touched it briefly and said, "It was my mother's." He nodded, and he did not ask anything further, because he understood without needing to. That evening, she sat on the back porch until the light was entirely gone from the sky. She thought about her mother. She thought about a woman who had chosen, across 30 years of ordinary living, to hold enormous power in complete silence, and who had built the invisible architecture of her daughter's future without a single person around her being any the wiser. She thought about what it means to be so certain of your own foundation that you don't need the storm to stop. You just need to stay standing while it runs out of force. She thought about a Tuesday morning in April. A leather portfolio opened across a desk, a document slid forward, one slow nod. She thought about a man who had stood at a graveside and decided, with breathtaking certainty, that the worst moment of a woman's life was the right moment to destroy her. She was not destroyed. She was, if anything, more clearly herself than she had been in years. That is the enduring truth about the people who underestimate you. They are never accounting for what you already know, what you have already done, and what you were already holding in your hands before they made their move. And by the time they understand what that was, the decision has already been made, the papers have already been signed, and the pendant is already back where it belongs. Friends, before we close, sit for just a moment with what this story actually is. It is the story of a woman who had every reason in the world to fall apart in public, and chose instead to stand still. She didn't perform her grief for anyone's approval. She didn't rage, beg, or announce herself. She prepared quietly, completely, and then she let the world do what the world will do when the truth is already in place. That is not passivity. That is not weakness. That is a form of courage most people will spend their entire lives never developing. The courage to trust your own foundation when someone is actively trying to knock it out from under you. Iris understood it, and she made sure her daughter understood it too, even if she had to leave it in a sealed trust for 30 years to make the lesson land. If this story moved you in any way today, please share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. A friend who is being underestimated. Someone going through something that feels impossible. Someone who needs to be reminded that quiet strength is still strength. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We tell stories like this every single week. Stories built around real emotion, real consequences, and the moments that quietly change everything. And please leave a comment below, not just to let us know you watched, but tell us honestly. Which moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was it the cemetery? Was it Iris and the 30 years of silence? Was it the text message Conrad sent the evening he learned about the money? 3 words he hadn't spoken in 4 years? Tell us your answer. We are listening, and we will see you in the next story very soon.